Welcome to this week's PRSA Maryland Weekly Chat. We're focusing today on internal communications in the age of the coronavirus. I'm your host, Diana Fornaro, and I'm a board member of PRSA Maryland, and I'm also accreditation manager for the group. I'm also Senior Communications Specialist with Chesapeake and Flores Insurance Company. Quickly, for the benefit of the HR folks on this call, PRSA stands for Public Relations Society of America. We are the Maryland chapter, and we have about 300 members, give or take, in the greater Baltimore area. We started these free weekly video chat sessions back in March to help our members, as well as non-members, connect and share experiences during this very, very unusual crisis. They have since become very popular, our weekly chats, and they've caught the attention of PRSA National in New York, so we're very proud of that fact. Also on the call today is Peggy Hoffman of Mariner Management and PRSA Maryland. Peggy's helping me moderate this call today. And most importantly, I'd like to introduce our four panelists, two of whom are from the communications side of the equation and two are from the HR side today. So we have with us today Jody Davidson, Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion for the Sodexo Corporation. Welcome, Jody. Tia Mason Howard, Director of Internal Communications for MedStar Health. Welcome, Tia. Tom Williams, Managing Director of Communications from Maryland Public Television. Welcome, Tom. And Christy Yowell, Associate Vice President for Human Resources at Goucher College. Welcome, Christy, and welcome, everyone. So for those who joined us on this call today, you may recall that when you registered, we asked you about your pain points around the topic of internal communications in the age of the coronavirus, COVID-19. You shared a number of those with us, and since we only have 45 minutes together here today, we're going to jump right in. I wanted to mention, if you would please feel free to use the chat feature in this Zoom platform. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. We'll be monitoring that throughout the call, and that's just a way for us to just keep everything organized and for folks not to talk over one another. And I'll also open up for questions at the end in case we didn't get to something that you wanted to ask about. So without further ado, I'm gonna start asking the first question. Alrighty, so the first question. When the coronavirus pandemic hit the US back in February and March, many organizations immediately started focusing on their external stakeholders, making sure their customers knew how the organization valued them, especially as they had to close down or curtail operations for an indefinite period of time. But what about their internal stakeholders? What are some of the consequences of overlooking your internal groups during a crisis?
And regularly, that anxiety builds, and that uncertainty and lack of two-way communications can really take, I think, its toll on your organization and its employees.
Very good. Tia, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think with internal comms, it's important that internal and external communications should align, particularly when you're dealing with a pandemic. You want to make sure you're messaging what you're having going out, parallels whatever you're sending internally. And when you think about the risks, you risk trust, because when you think about our employees, they are our brand ambassadors, and a lot of times the customers turn to the internal stakeholders for information. And as Tom mentioned, you risk information and whether or not it's accurate or not. So you want to make sure there's accuracy in that. And of course, you risk your reputation. So it's important to address that and build and sustain the trust you already have with all your stakeholders.
Right. Very good. Okay. So how about where is internal communications handled? Are they typically handled by HR or communications or another department? Jody, how about your company? How do they handle internal?
We have, thank you, Diana. We have a corporate communications department, which is, if you think about an inverted pyramid, if you will, the communications department would be at the top, and then we have various stakeholder constituency groups that are doing some content creation, but surely including human resources needing to partner.
Right.
So an example is that one of our director, I guess senior director level corp comm individual sits on the HR leadership team, and you know, having that type of awareness and knowledge, and where does it fit into strategy. And then there's the question of internally facing versus the externally facing that you kind of touched on in your first question, and how do those things balance one another as well?
I love that. I love that they have a seat at the table. I love that. How about you, Christy, about your organization, Goucher?
Yeah, much like Jody's saying, we have that central communications and marketing group, but the senior cabinet of our organization is meeting weekly, if not more regularly, during this pandemic. And we're really all working together to talk about all of our communications, but which office they come out from really is dictated by the message. So for example, our vice president of communications or our president may send out campus-wide communications to our college community. If they are staff or employment focused, they're more likely to come out under my name. If they're more student focused, one of our student-facing divisions. We also have very, for consistency of communication, so it doesn't look like just a haphazard email. We're also very deliberate in working with our communications folks on some standardized templates with those office titles on the top, but it makes it stand out from a regular run-of-the-mill email as well.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah, Christy, I think what you're saying is really important, and one of the directives that we hear from our corporate communications department is not to have standalone communications, that people have communication overload. So of course there's a push-pull. Somebody like myself who is a diversity practitioner would want the message to stand out versus it getting buried inside of something broader. But what's the fine line? And maybe our communications experts would have an answer to that.
Yeah, well, and I think it's also really important, as Jody and I both mentioned, that collaboration with communications, regardless of who's sending out that message, making sure that everyone's on board.
I see. Yeah.
So that people know what messages are being sent, what the sequencing of messages should be, the content, the timing of those messages. I can't tell you how regularly I'm talking on our campus, as the HR practitioner with both communications and student-facing departments, because we're all putting out similar information, and sequence makes a big difference. So we're talking very regularly.
Well, that segues into my next question, and actually some of the questions we received around how frequently do you communicate during COVID-19, and what are some of those tactics? I mean, are they branded separately? Is it a special edition of something you normally put out? Is it a special communique altogether different? Is it video-based as opposed to print-based? How about these kinds of questions? Tia?
Sure. So, I mean, when you think about how the pandemic, when it began, and so as the pandemic evolved, I think so did our communication approaches and methods. And so overall as an organization, it's a coordinated effort because you want to make sure you're aligned in that way, but we also recognize there are different stakeholder groups from clinicians to operational. So you want to make sure that you segment in such a way that it's important. And then leadership engagement is critical. So we use various tactics starting from the top down. So the frequency could pretty much vary. There's some standard times of updates. So from daily calls, also leveraging standard communication or pubs that you may already have. So leverage what we already have standard existing and scheduled. And then we also found that, particularly in the beginning, you be transparent. As we learn things, we will share it. So because we had all these questions coming in, developing an FAQ and turning around fairly quickly to make sure that we're addressing those top overarching concerns was priority number one, but also making sure it was coordinated in such a way where all of our leadership is engaged, that we're sending out the same message. So, when you think about a pandemic, it's pretty much cyclical, particularly in the beginning. But as time moved on, leveraging our intranet, other kind of platforms as well. So the kind of the go-to site, if you will, for everyone, so they know how it applies to them and what they need to know.
Right, right. Tom, anything to add to that?
No, I think that engagement by leadership is really important, and that there be established frequency for some forms of communication, not all. So our leadership team, we're a much smaller organization. We're talking about 145 state employees plus contractors on top of that. So much maybe different entity than some of the others on the phone. But what we did early on is we made a commitment to have all staff video conferences between all of our employees and our CEO every 2 weeks.
Wow.
So soon after we started, they knew that they would have that regular form of communication in that sort of cadence. So we not only had an opportunity to address COVID-19 issues, but because our senior leadership team meets every week and they voice their team's concerns or their team's questions, those can be integrated into that CEO-led all-staff conference or video conference call. So that's one way we make sure we address their concerns. And in the midst of this, because we're a state agency, we're also facing the impacts of the state's deficit.
Yeah.
So as we get closer to our end of fiscal year, June 30, employees have questions about what's that going to mean for us?
Right.
How will our, we certainly, restricted and pulled back on spending before the end of this fiscal year, but then we were in the midst of budgeting for FY21 beginning July 1.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going through that exercise. People have questions, and we're trying to we're as transparent as we can be, and we're certainly ultimately affected by what the governor decides needs to happen, and certainly then the legislature as well. So, we know employees want to know the current status of all that, and our CEO, I think, is doing a very good job with that and letting people know as soon as possible what the current state of affairs is. So in terms of that level of engagement, we're I think, doing a good job, and people, I think, feel that they're being listened to and that they're getting
Yes.
information at a steady flow or cadence.
Very good, very good. If you've just joined us, thank you for joining us. This is PRSA Maryland's weekly chat. We're focusing on internal communications in the age of the coronavirus. My next question is okay, this is really a good one. How do you communicate effectively with employees when they're working remotely and oftentimes working odd hours? Let's see, who would like to take that? How about Jody?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. So, Sodexo is a very large global organization. So in some instances, depending on the level of the individual, we were used to working across various time zones. The piece that I have concern about, having lots and lots of years of focusing on flexibility with remote or telework being a piece of the puzzle, is that it's not that people have intentionally said yes to this nature of working, and they may not be set up properly. So to provide that level of support, to have the invitation of over communication, using platforms like this one with proper security measures in place, in order to, the pressure is on for people to turn their cameras on. And I think that there is a sense of isolation for many in these times. Now, I have a family of 5 of us that live under the same roof with 3 dogs, so I'm not entirely feeling as isolated as others. But having a connection point that's high touch, I think, is extremely important in these times, more so than ever before.
Oh, yes. Christy, anything to add?
No, I agree with everything Jody's saying. My workforce luckily is more of a, not exclusively 9 to 5, but more of a weekday single location workforce. But even there, one of the things we struggle with are those workforces that don't have as much ample access or maybe not as tech savvy as others. So for us, when we're thinking about communications, it's not just the high touch of how to stay in touch remotely. It's also how do you continue to stay in touch and engage with that part of your workforce that is not very tech savvy or may not have that technology. So for us, they may or may not even be working at the moment, but there's a lot of deliberate thought around communications. And when we send things out via a Zoom town hall or an email or a video, how do you even get it to those employees that may or may not be working to even know that it exists? So we're also supplementing our strategies with a lot of print materials posted at our work site for those that are still there. Sometimes even doing direct mailings to homes of other employees, especially as they relate to return to a physical location plans, to make sure that they're staying knowledgeable and in the know and they don't suffer from that isolation, particularly around their technology limitations.
Very good. Thank you for that. We did have a question that had come in. What has been the most successful in communicating with employees who are not based at a computer? So you just answered that.
Diana, if I might add to that, Sodexo has a huge contingent of frontline employees, and at like blink of an eye, everything changed, where some of our frontline employees were deemed as essential, for example, in hospitals and assisted living. And then we have other frontline employees who are in a temporary unit closure situation, be it like corporate headquarters buildings and the like. And we have, maybe there's some advice on the line or with some of your attendees. The connection point that is made with individuals who are not necessarily hooked up into the system, be it internet and email and other things. We've been working on communicating through a text, it's called text HR, I believe, where we're actually pinging people in the hopes that that's going to create a different connection point. So just the balance of knowing that some employees are not remote and what happens with those individuals as well.
Right.
Jody, you bring up a great point when you talk about those on the front lines. I think arming leaders with tools they need for their huddles and rounding, we have found to be effective as well.
Yeah.
So that type of consistent communication has been helpful. With the text HR mobile, that's another thing that is always something that I think is as effective as well. So to be able to do that as a large enterprise is not an easy undertaking.
We have individuals who are bilingual that are kind of a help desk, if you will, of respondents, so that they have office hours of responding to the text.
Oh, very good. Interesting. I wasn't aware of that technology. So Tia, yeah, with your various locations with MedStar, yeah.
Diana, I'll add,
Go ahead.
real quick, one other thing that we've done on our campus that, is simple, but I think it was very effective. We had questions coming in, as everyone else has mentioned, questions about how will my pay be impacted? What am I doing for work? Should I be working? What about my safety? And coming from a lot of different populations, for me on a college campus, it's students and parents and visitors and employees and the like. So we, with our communications folks, created a simple ask a question on our COVID-19 page. And we constantly ping people and point it to that website. And that way, regardless of what the question is, you can ask your question without spending a half a day trying to figure out who to ask when you may not know because it's never come up before. And our communications department is doing a great job of kind of managing the intake of those questions and then getting them out to the right departments. It's also allowing our communications department to oversee and kind of monitor the type of questions that are coming in, which then helps generate future agendas for various meetings and also develop those FAQs that everyone's been talking about.
Very good. Very good. What about company culture? How do you, has anyone had success keeping up company culture for a large company? Like getting people engaged in sharing and caring?
I think I saw that Tom was going to say something a moment ago. Is that right,
No,
Tom?
no, it's okay.
So you're wanting to know about culture, Diana?
Yeah, that we had one of the questions come in. One of the participants asked that question in particular. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I can start. It's certainly, this is a strange and challenging time, and Goucher, like most workplaces, probably has a ton of work that we still need and want to do in this area. But it's certainly been on the forefront of our minds. And one of the things that we did early on, not early on, probably midway, through the pandemic so far, was really acknowledged the strangeness of this situation, and we put together a campaign asking our employees whether they were working on essentially a ghost campus or if they were working from home to send us videos or photos of what that was like. What it's like to work on a deserted campus, what it's like in your home office, share that. What it's like trying to work at a table that you're also sharing with your children who are doing schoolwork while you're being their teacher. And for us, we even had, dance instructors at the college doing Zoom dance meetings and sharing them with us. And then we even had when it doesn't go well, someone sent a picture of like their toddler hanging off the side of their desk and their dog running away with their file folders. And, it was just, it gave a sense of that connection and this isn't always pretty and we don't always have it right and we're all learning together. And it was a very humbling, connecting kind of experience. And when we got all of those, it united us again, and our communications department turned that into just a great little simple video that we sent out, really thanking all of our employees for their hard and continued work during this unusual time.
That's exciting. That's great. I love it. Love it.
Yeah, one of the things we've leveraged internally, we receive a lot of kudos from patients, the community, kudos for our healthcare workers. And so we share that internally as well as kind of a reinforcement messaging as a thank you and a gratitude. Also for the entity I support, we have a social recognition platform where colleagues give each other kudos, or what we call give a wow. And so that continued even through a pandemic with all of the stress. They're still giving each other kudos for experiencing and showcasing their values, posting photos of donations and things like that. So that's one way we keep the momentum of the culture going.
Very good.
I think what Tia says there is important. People in your organization want to know that their efforts are valued, that what they're doing, and even in the midst, as Christy said, this crazy, unusual time, and we're all kind of struggling to make things work and accomplish our objectives, that we think, oh, we're struggling, so people might not think what we're doing is value. And when you can, and however creatively you can, make sure they know your key target audiences or stakeholders know that what you're doing is valuable. So, in other words, we've had to, in our case, cut back on the production of our television programming. So we're not doing as much of what we're great at, but we're doing the best we can. So using, in some cases, some creative solutions, in other cases, just hunkering down and focusing on the things we can do best right now. When we hear from our stakeholders, our viewers, and others who have great things to say, we make sure that we share those. So where we used to have a pop-up message on everyone's computer when they arrived in the morning or arrived to work, with information from the communications team and across our enterprise of what great things are happening. We're doing that now as an e-blast, and we used to be called the MPT Daily. Now we're calling it the Not Quite Daily, and we do it real creative, right? But so, probably 3 times every 2 weeks that goes out, and at the end of every message are those kudos where we're sharing with people what our viewers are saying about us during this time, where we're not bringing them exactly what they're used to seeing, but it's still having an impact, and our people need to know that people are appreciative of what they're doing.
I hope you can't see my chat box in the middle of my screen. We had a question from one of our participants listening in today, what is the name of the social recognition platform? I guess, Tia, the one that you had mentioned?
Yeah, so there are many vendors out there for social recognition platforms or anything along that way. The one that we currently use just for our entity with our group within itself for our physician practices and ambulatory is Terryberry is the name of the platform, but there are a bunch of them out there and they've probably gone through a brand change too, but Terryberry is the underlying vendor.
Okay. All right, there we go. Okay, so here's another question. So yeah, we just spoke about social interaction. This crisis is unprecedented in that messaging from our government leaders and medical experts are changing daily and even hourly in some cases. How do you communicate effectively under these circumstances when the messages are constantly changing? Tom?
Well, in our case, you know, we take our guidance from the state of Maryland.
Right.
So if you know our governor, he's very
Right. He's out in
very
front.
proactive and assertive in communicating what the state of Maryland's stances are on various COVID-19 related issue. And of course, because we're based in Baltimore County, we also follow the guidelines that are being offered by our county executive. So topics that our folks want to know about and any changes to the way we're doing things, the way we're executing safety protocols or anything else of importance to our employees, our vendors, the limited number of folks who come into our studio these days. Those are very clearly articulated in a number of forums. I talked to you about the CEO, all staff calls. HR will put out important, timely information via email to our employees, and this not quite daily vehicle that we have too. So we're trying to use these various touch points in different ways to ensure that our people know what's changing and how it affects them.
Very good.
Yeah, and then on top of the state guidance, you know, being a healthcare organization, of course, we follow CDC-based guidance, aligning with our own policies and World Health Organization as well. So the cadence is pretty much the same. When it was fast going, it was pretty frequent from top down and a coordinated effort to do that. But it was basically company policy, CDC-based guidance.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah, and on our college campus, very much the same as what everyone else has been saying, you know, that CDC, WHO guidance. We also reference a lot the governor's roadmap to recovery here in Maryland. And we're starting to put out more specific documents in my workplace about what that return to the physical workplace will look like. And while we may be more vague or allow ourselves some flexibility with specific dates, we can use all of that guidance and that documentation to talk about things in phases. You know, in this phase will happen first, and this is what that phase is going to look like. We may or may not know exact dates yet, but this is going to be the sequencing of how we start getting back to that state of normalcy and start reopening things. So those various state and federal guidelines and documentation have been very helpful in doing that.
Right. So I wanted to circle back though on this question. Primarily, I guess maybe for Jody and Christy, we are essentially social creatures. For a lot of people, work is a place to go for the social interaction as much as for the paycheck. How do we maintain those relationships while working remotely in this new normal? How do you focus on employees' well-being as well as engagement, but importantly as well, morale during such a crisis?
So I'll share that at Sodexo back in March, there was a message of kind of settling down and dialing back inclusion and diversity and HR related programming. And I was really struck by the fact that these were the very things that make people feel connected, whether it's in person or virtually. And I just somehow, Diane, was called to create a program that wound up being called Practicing Inclusion and Flexibility During Times of Crisis. the instruction was kind of do it underground with the employee business resource groups, and then word of mouth hit, and I knew that I was onto something when there was an invitation in the CEO daily message, hey, tomorrow there's this session. So I went from like a handful of people on these calls to that particular day was close to 150 attendees.
Wow.
And since then, I've reached well over 1,000 individuals at this time. The same thing holds true, I think, well, let me just say what it is a place for people to process out loud and exhale about what it is that they're going through, so much like the pictures that were being described. This is where on a call, people are courageously speaking their truth about the challenges that they're facing, whether it's parenting and homeschooling, or whether it's an elder that they're not able to see, or that the disappointment of having a birthday that they can't celebrate with friends, or I'm going on and on, but it's just the heartstrings. People whose children are graduating high school and they can't have the prom, and all of those things are spoken aloud. And so we're creating a space for validation, and there's a technique about shifting our mindset. We get into some breathing practices online, and then after that we move into some best practices for what we're calling physical, not social distance. The employee business resource groups have a virtual coffee thing every other week. And there may be, it's almost like, how do we say, loose but tight? Like there's a bit of a framework, but enough that it's a conversation rather than something like a didactic training would be. And so these kinds of things that happen either in an open enrollment sort of way or in an intact team are really important to be supportive of our employee base.
That's wonderful.
That's awesome.
Don't we all wish we worked for
Yes. And I'm not going to top that because that's amazing from a company level. I will say, I just want to give a shout out to all those department managers out there, because at my company, and I'm sure others are seeing this as well, when this is being done well, it's not just what the parent company is doing at that high level. It's also what those department managers are managing to maintain, where those relationships and that interaction were happening anyway, that are keeping things going. Some of the amazing things I've heard about are colleagues that had an every Friday night happy hour that are still doing it virtually. Managers that really, promoted their staff having lunch together, and every day at 12:30, they log in together and just shut down the work and have a general chatty, how are the kids? What are you up to? What's going well? What's not? What's going on in your life over lunch? And finding those ways to remain connected like they were in a physical workplace. And they're being done at some of the lower levels within the organization. So I think it's kind of that dual prong approach of how to keep that going.
That's awesome. That is really
That's
awesome.
great.
That's awesome. All right, I'm just checking on our time here. We have about 10 minutes left. Shall we open it up to some Q&A? Some of the participants, would you guys like to ask some questions? Lisa, is Lisa Coster on the call? Yes, let me see if we can introduce our president.
Yes.
Our PRSA Maryland president, Lisa Coster, has joined us. So would you like to ask a question or just say hello, Lisa?
Thank you all for doing this today. I really appreciated our weekly chats. Have been very, very successful. Diana, thank you for moderating today, and our members are really appreciating it. As you know, with associations, membership matters, especially during a tough time like this.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't really have any specific questions. I'm a sole proprietor, so my internal comms has been, I hope strong. But
yourself, right, Lisa?
I too, like everyone else, am struggling with a lack of socialization as a PR person and not going to client sites and client meetings and engaging in business lunches and networking events off of this platform. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate all your advice, and I'm sure our members have enjoyed your advice today. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. No problem. So are there any questions from the participants? Nobody seems to have their hand up, or
nope.
Anyone else in the chat? All right, we'll move on with some of our other questions here. All right, I think we've covered a lot of this. Company culture. What about, how do you make your communications interesting? Audio and video. What are the best attended all company message events? Who would like to take that one?
I can start. I'll just say, I don't know that we have anything great and innovative that others haven't talked about, but our best attended by far have been our town halls. We don't hold those quite as regularly as some of those other communications like emails and updates. But when we do the town halls, we've done them by population specific, and they have had by far the best attendance at all. And we do them a lot like we've done today's call. Here's the information we're going to cover, and then we leave ample time at the end for just open Q&A. And then follow that up with questions we can't get to. We do some specific follow-up as, kind of generalized FAQ responses to those.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have, web conferencing capability that we have with our different stakeholder groups, and those tend to be the most well-attended, where it's direct Q&A. We have some key points and agenda topics that we want to cover, and then it's just an exchange for about an hour, 45 minutes, where it's pretty much whatever you have questions about on a frequent cadence.
Wow.
Those have been the most attended.
Great, okay. How to engage your audience when your physical interaction is limited? We kind of touched on that with the various tactics that we've already been talking about. Any other ideas around that? How about how to keep all working remotely in the loop in a timely fashion after a day's decision made remotely by departments?
I'll just share something that's outside of that question set, Diana, if I might. I'm reflecting on the approach of top-down, bottom-up, and middle-out. And, in a decentralized organization, there can be a stopgap in between the highest layer and line of sight. And so middle management becomes extremely critical and important. And this is more of an inclusion effort. We have what we call district inclusion ambassadors, and we have some programming that is to serve frontline more in the whatever normal means, right? It's around creating connectivity where frontline feel affirmed, that their voice matters, that there's opportunities and meaningful work that aligns with the mission of the organization. So it could be like a huddle that takes 5 minutes for managers to share directly. It could be a training that we have decided needs to be deployed around, for example, partnering with HR on the topic of sexual harassment. And it could be deploying a program like frontline mentoring, for example. And so we really depend on having that internal, like middle cog in the wheel, and it, if you will, and it provides a stretch assignment for the individual that the district manager nominates for this role as well. So there may be some more of those kinds of, what's the top tier communication that goes downward, the bottom up providing voice so that people know that what they're expressing counts and matters, and then the middle piece for an organization like Sodexo that enables us not to get like stuck in between those other two layers.
I love hearing that. What about for more centralized organizations? Anyone have any thoughts around that? Okay. And one more question here. Effective and creative ways to communicate with both frontline and remote employees. I think we talked about that as well.
We did.
Anyone have anything else to share around that? All right. One last question. How about this? What have you found successful, and what lessons can you share from these first few months on lockdown?
I'll take a stab at it. You know, our CEO was always very good about engaging with employees with no barrier between him and anyone within the organization. He would host periodic, town halls or all staff meetings. But the fact that now he's been able, in this regular cadence of every 2 weeks, be at least in front of people on video, talk to them about, here's the straight thing, here's what's going on. And if a question is asked and he doesn't know the answer to it, he won't try to fumble through it. He said, that's a good question, and we'll have to work to get everyone an answer on that. So, he's as transparent as he can be. We'll say, I don't know, if he doesn't know, and he'll address the question afterwards. So I think it's probably strengthened the connection all of our folks have with our president and CEO. And I would hope as we come out of this, we'll have learned something, as I'm specifying here, and that we then apply that learning as we move forward.
Yes, exactly.
Diana, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm looking at the time and I see that there's a question in the chat from Pratik Patkar.
Okay. And what is that question?
I'll just go for it. I can't help myself. I tend to facilitate these things. The question is, how do you encourage people who are really not excited to get on calls? Seems there are way too many calls being set up by managers just to check on how everyone is doing. After a while, it gets a little irritating. How does one say no politely? I would say in brief that at the organization that I work for, establishing some norms and that some options are available, that not everything needs to be mandatory, to have agendas in advance, and kind of create a process of discernment where people can decide this is a call that is mandatory. Like, it would be a career glamour don't if I do not appear. And then there are some others that are just kumbaya, we love you, man. Like, come on if you want to. So balancing that would be my response to that question.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you so much. I couldn't see the question, so I apologize, Pratik. So hopefully that answers your question. Does anyone else want to comment on Pratik's question? All right, it looks like we're almost out of time here. It's 1:44 by my watch. I want to respect everyone's time. We said we were going to only go till 1:45 today. I neglected to mention we did record this session today, and this will be available on the PRSA Maryland website in case anyone on the call wants to reference it later, or anyone missed the call and want to tune in. So I thank everyone for participating today, all those who called in today, and I especially want to thank our panelists today. Thank you so much for participating. And everyone, please continue to stay safe and well. Thank you, and we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
afternoon.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.